Wondering what made the NES just as successful as it was? I mean, it is difficult to even think of competition to the NES in the US, especially if you're not a retro gaming nerd, nor did you have something else growing up. The interesting thing is that the competition to the NES was generally stronger and faster looking at it on paper. The Sega Master System and Atari 7800 both had multiple things going for it, and the same goes for some 8-bit home computers like the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, yet the NES outsold everything in its way. Quickly in its lifetime, the Famicom was outpaced by technology, and Nintendo saw developers struggling to fit their games on the system. However, because of an odd way the Famicom and NES stored video memory, it was very well suited for upgrades. And soon after the NES's release, Nintendo began creating extra chips to put into cartridges that could help store memory outside the console. These would be known as either multi-memory controllers or memory management controllers, or MMCs. The NES was very limited in its video memory capabilities, so most of these chips were essentially little tricks to store more tile sets for games. These chips were introduced for the Famicom in early 1986, less than 3 years after the console's release. They'd be seen in fairly early NES games like Gradius and Arkanoid. Early on, tiles could only be used from one tile set at a time, stored in separate memory banks. But by the time games like Mario 3 came out, they were able to flip through graphics in 2 kilobyte chunks, which meant you would never need to duplicate tiles in different banks, and can thus store even more graphics than with upgrades in games like Gradius. By the end of the NES's lifetime, games like Kirby's Adventure were possible, the ROM of which is 768 kilobytes, 256 of which are just graphics, in comparison to the NES's default being only 40 kilobytes in total. Some other games use these chips for some other interesting tricks, however, so I'll have to talk about those another time and leave you to. Do you ever wonder what the graphical glitch on the right side of Super Mario Bros. 3 is? It has to do with a key difference between Mario 3 and its earlier installments. If you think about it, it is kind of weird that neither the original Mario nor the second installment have this glitch, so why would the third game, seemingly an upgrade, have something like this? First off, Mario 3 is certainly an upgrade overall, making use of an expansion chip, something I talked about recently, called an MMC3. Something you may notice about the original Super Mario Bros. Is that the levels are only horizontal, with no vertical gameplay. The US release of Mario Bros. 2 does in fact have vertical gameplay, but you may notice that the screen only ever scrolls vertically or horizontally, never both at the same time. Mario 3 on the other hand is capable of doing both and scrolling diagonally. The strategy needed to do this is what creates that graphical glitch. To understand this, you'll need to know that the NES generally uses 2 tables of data to represent the current graphics on screen, a name table and an attribute table. The name table is essentially a grid that represents the makeup of the tiles on screen. Tiles are 8x8 pixels, and the name table keeps track of what tile goes in each place. The attribute table is similar, but instead of representing what tiles go in each place, it represents the color palette of each tile. However, what is important to understand is that there are 2 sets of name tables and attribute tables. The second set essentially makes up what is just off screen, allowing the camera to scroll to the right with the player and reveal what is next. As it does so, the tiles we leave behind the camera are overwritten with tiles further ahead. Then the camera snaps back to the beginning of the first name table. This works the same way vertically, but when we're scrolling on both axes at the same time, things get pretty tricky because there is nowhere to smoothly and discreetly load in the next set of tiles off screen. Finally, there is something called name table mirroring, in which both sets of name tables and attribute tables are copied. This is an important part of keeping a seamless transition when scrolling. There is vertical mirroring for games that scroll horizontally and horizontal mirroring for games that scroll vertically. But Mario 3 does both at once, so which one does it use? This is where the fundamental issue comes in. Mario 3 uses horizontal mirroring, meaning it can seamlessly scroll up and down, but not left to right. Tiles are loaded directly on the right, allowing the player to see artifacts in which the wrong tiles are displayed, and they're in the wrong palette, often being green. There are ways to cover this up anyway, but obviously Nintendo decided that this was acceptable. How does a game on the NES have vector graphics? We've been talking about the inner workings of the Nintendo Entertainment System and particularly its shortcomings in the graphics department. Although the system comes with a pretty powerful CPU for its time, its graphics are somewhat limited and oddly done. A lot of great games were able to stretch these limits. One such game would be 1991's Elite. This was originally a 1984 home computer title with somewhat dazzling 3D graphics, but would be ported to the NES, notably in Europe only. It is the only NES game to feature full 3D polygon graphics, and for good reason. We have talked about expansion chips in NES cartridges before. They're usually used to keep more banks of tiles, as the default amount is pretty limited. Because of the multitude of different angles every polygon could be viewed at, there would be far too many combinations of tiles in Elite to all be stored on the cartridge. This is why Elite had its own RAM to make new tiles on the fly, rather than switching between predefined banks. However, this process is pretty intensive, which would be why the game was never released in the US market. With the US NES, only about 60 new tiles could be drawn on each frame, but the European NES could draw more due to a lower frame rate, which is why the graphics here are noticeably choppy. The fact that a home computer game of this magnitude was able to be ported to the NES is pretty astounding, and the game itself was an open-ended space trading game that was considered revolutionary. It would end up being ported to essentially every home computer on the market at the time and would spawn multiple sequels, including Elite Dangerous. Another NES game to have a gripping graphical gimmick would be 1991's Vice Project Doom. I have now talked a good amount about the graphical limitations of the Nintendo Entertainment System. These limitations could be significantly expanded by special chips installed in game cartridges, for example the MMC3 chip, which was the most widely used in the later years of the NES. One feature this chip had that I'm yet to talk about was something called a scanline counter. While games I've talked about previously, like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Kirby's Adventure, do make use of this feature, this game, Vice Project Doom, relies on it. A scanline counter is essentially exactly what it sounds like. Scanlines are how the NES sends video information to the television, essentially horizontal row by row, each row being a single pixel. The television then takes these rows and draws them one by one in order, very quickly to produce an image. This means that the image on screen is not all drawn at once, which means you could theoretically change a frame as it is being drawn. By default, the Nintendo Entertainment System had a limited way to make use of this, known as Sprite Zero detection. This method, however, could only be used once per frame and thus wouldn't be enough for what Vice Project Doom is able to accomplish. With the scanline counter keeping track of how many lines have been scanned into the television at any given time, we can easily split the screen multiple times, change tile sets, and in the case of Vice Project Doom, the speed at which the background scrolls. This is what allows for the background of the game to be scrolling at different speeds, creating the parallax effect and the illusion of depth in the background. This would become a more standard feature after this game and would be included in many other cartridge enhancement chips. Interestingly, parallax can be something that is still relatively complicated to pull off, and it took us a while to get it right in our game, Rutabaga Desert Storm, but how we did that is a story for another time. Have you ever noticed in Punch-Out when you get knocked down, Little Mac's shorts and gloves change color? Usually they are green, but as he gets up and walks back into the match, they're white before suddenly switching back to green. Why is this the case? Well, this is a common problem in NES games due to, you guessed it, hardware limitations. The NES has 56 colors at its disposal, but it can only actually display 25 different colors at any given time. Interestingly, this color palette was hand-chosen by Nintendo rather than mathematically generated with bits, which is how the NES's competition, like the Sega Master System, handled it. In fact, it's how we still handle it today, but instead of using 2 bits like the Master System and having a palette of 64, modern computers usually use 24 bits, which allows for over 16 million colors. But back to the NES. It uses palettes of 4 colors each to store color information, but it can only have 8 palettes at once. 4 palettes for the background and 4 for the foreground. Well, this doesn't sound right. I said it can have 25 colors, but 8 palettes of 4 would be 32 colors? Well, the first color in each palette is always stored as a transparent color. It essentially tells the system's PPU to just not render anything designated with that color. This means each palette is really more like 3 colors each, and 8 times 3 is 24, plus that transparent color makes for 25 colors at once. However, when we split these palettes between the background and the foreground, sprites in the foreground only get about 12 colors max. Newer NES games were able to get around this with something I talked about in a previous video called a scanline counter. It essentially allowed the NES to change palettes as the graphics were being rendered to the TV. Older games like Punch-Out, however, couldn't make use of this and had only 12 colors to work with for Little Mac, the opponent, and the HUD at the top. On top of this, each 8x8 tile can only access one color palette at a time, which means that certain things that use one of the same colors, but also different colors, will need an entirely new palette that may repeat a color or two. This is pretty inefficient. It means that a lot of the time, you're not really actually getting 12 colors at once. Nonetheless, this seems fine. Little Mac's shorts are green throughout the fight. In the beginning, I said his shorts turn white when he gets up, but this was misleading, because what really causes his shorts to turn white would be Mario entering the frame. There simply aren't enough palettes to go around, and so the tiles that make up Little Mac's sprite change to the same palette that makes up the bottom of Mario's sprite to save space. This palette is almost the same, but swaps green for white, making Little Mac's shorts and gloves white while Mario is on the screen. This is a pretty common trick to accommodate the NES's limitations. Even the original Super Mario Bros. Uses it, like making Goombas blue in the blue underground levels.